Hello, second panel of our Postcolonial Studies Centre conference, Patterns of Struggle and Solidarity. The title of this panel is called it's the Dynamics of Struggle, and I am delighted to welcome Sephora Jose, Aswathi Moncy Joseph, Putul Sathe, and Margarida Martins to this panel. As you know, the first panel also was a real treat, and we have 4 more excellent papers coming our way, so that is fantastic. So I will listen to each paper sort of in turns, and then at the end there's time for questions. So please, as in the previous panels, please put your questions into the chat or email us at psc@ntu.ac.uk. So the first paper is by Sephora Jose. It's called When the Broken Breaks Through, Politics of Struggle and Solidarity in Manjadikkari, which is about a Dalit play. And there are very few papers out there on Dalit plays, so I'm really delighted. Sephora is a research scholar in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in the Indian Institute of Technology in Kanpur. She's currently pursuing research about the cultural production of Dalit Christian sects in Kerala, and her area of research includes Dalit studies and cultural studies. So, thank you.
Good afternoon, friends. My presentation is titled When the Broken Breaks Through, Politics of Struggle and Solidarity in Manjadikkari. The place you see in this picture is Manjadikkari, located in the Curating district of Kerala. It is a space inhabited mostly by Dalits, the broken, especially Dalit Christians. As evinced in the picture, the place is marked by material deprivation. The place does not have proper transportation facilities like roads. The houses, as you can see in the picture, are too small. Being surrounded by water bodies, the place is prone to natural calamities like floods. The people in this locality suffer from scarcity of drinking water. The majority of the people in the area are agricultural daily wage workers who have been economically and culturally marginalized. Caste discrimination and exploitation mark their past and present. The people in Manjadikkari articulate anti-caste discourse through their cultural productions like songs, stories, and plays that form in their community groups. In this presentation, I am looking at one such cultural production named Azhagante Kudil, a play, which means Arrogance Hut, authored by Thangama Titus from Manjadikkari, to understand the anti-caste discourse articulated by the text. Throughout this presentation, whenever I use the term Brahmanism, it denotes the oppressive and exploitative relation between the upper caste and the lower caste and outcasts. This is the outline of my presentation. Since Manjadikkari is a Dalit space, the cultural activism in the place is primarily an engagement with caste-class discriminations. The cultural productions of the place therefore need to be contextualized in order to understand the anti-caste politics of the text. The term anti-caste discourse is a set of ideas and actions which engage with the caste system. The form taken by these anti-caste engagements are determined by how caste is understood or defined. The manifestation of caste, its consequences and challenges also form part of the anti-caste discourse. It is important to understand that anti-caste negotiations are not merely oppositional, but very complex ways in which the subordinated Dalits negotiate with the dominant Brahminical system. And this can include internal contradictions also. Therefore, anti-caste discourse is a dynamic and complex set of ideas which negotiates with Brahmanism from a Dalit or anti-caste perspective. As I have pointed out earlier, Manjadikkari is a Dalit space, and majority of the people in Manjadikkari are agricultural daily wage workers. Most of them, especially adult women, are members of Tholilurappu, a rural employment program, a governmental project to ensure regular work for every family. There are various community groups also active in the place. Sanjeevani is one such group formed in 2019 as per the instructions of the Panchayat for people above the age of 55. The play Azhagante Kudil is written by Thangama Titus, who is a member of both Sanjeevani and Tholilurappu scheme. The conceptualization of the play happened in a group of Dalit women workers of the Tholilurappu scheme to perform in the anniversary celebrations of the club Sanjeevani. The play was written and rehearsed in their workplace during their break times. Before going into my analysis of the text, I would like to briefly summarize the play. The play is set in a village, showing the relationship between a landlord and his laborers, focusing on questions of labor and sexuality. The play starts with invocation and proceeds in 6 scenes in which Aragan, a Dalit man, and his family are being exploited by the landlord. The play opens in Aragan's hut, where Aragan and his wife Aragi grieve over the fact that the landlord has asked them to bring Chotan, their only son, to the field for work. Aragan's son Chiruda uh, is sexually harassed by the landlord. His son Chotan is in love with Kochitambrati, the landlord's daughter. So there is a ploughing scene in the play which shows the labor exploitation and dehumanization under Brahminical regime. You can see in the slide Aragan is tied to the plough along with the bull and beaten. At the play also shows the internal contradictions and conflicts within the Dalit community through the characters of Meeli and Kunjikarambi, who gossip about Chiruda, particularly about the sexual harassment of Chiruda. At the tragic end of the play, Aragan's son and daughter are found dead. Aragan's son's body is hung on the tree in front of their hut, and their daughter, Chiruda, her dead body is found in the marsh, implying rape and murder. The play defines caste as a hierarchical system which maintains and perpetrates unequal power relations through force and violence. Violence, as shown in the play, is imposed in 3 fields, which are labor, sexuality, and knowledge. The paratextual elements, by focusing on the Brahminical nature of knowledge, expose the relation between caste and Brahminical knowledge. Caste is understood as a system which privileges Brahminical knowledge and devalues knowledge that is produced from a Dalit standpoint. The plot of the text emphasizes on caste violence in terms of labor and sexuality. Caste is a division of laborers which sanctions control over Dalit labor. The violence as manifested in the realm of sexuality operates at 2 levels, access and desire. That means who has sexual access over whom and whose body is desired or who can express desire. Caste violence in the realm of knowledge is manifested in the erasure or silencing of Dalit narratives. The devaluation of Dalit experiences under the Brahminic regime results in the suppression or silencing of Dalit articulations and Dalit history. The prologue to the play raises this concern by talking about the experiences of torture, pain, and deprivation which have been silenced. The erasure of the history of Aryan invasion of Dravidians under the Brahminic regime is shown as a consequence of this epistemic violence. The denial of access to Brahminical texts like Vedas and scriptures is also an aspect of Brahminical epistemic violence, as the denial of knowledge deprives them of material resources as well as respect. The violence in terms of labor result in dehumanization and control through fear. The material dependence of the laborers on the landlord compels them to work for the landlord. In the ploughing scene, Aragan is tied to the plough along with a bull and beaten. He is animalized, deprived of his essential human dignity. The material underpinnings of caste violence are repeatedly shown through characters who are afraid to question the system, question the injustices done towards them. The laborers are afraid to question the exploitative system because their sustenance comes from the work they do for the landlord. Aragan is extremely sad and frustrated when the landlord asks him to take Chodan to the field for work. And yet Aragan and his wife Arigi, despite wanting to exclude Chodan from servitude, agree to take him to the field because they are concerned about their survival. One of the songs in the play, sung by the performers as a group, narrates the brutal punishments imposed on dissenters, like killing, burning their huts, and beating them mercilessly. The absolute obedience of the Dalit women to the commands of the landlord also exemplified the landlord's control over Dalit labor. Caste violence in the realm of sexuality means control of sexual freedom. It results in the sexual oppression of Dalit women by making them sexually available or accessible to the landlord. Chiruda, Aragan's daughter, is sexually harassed in the workplace by the landlord. Lack of sexual freedom is not only manifested in terms of access but also in terms of desire. as exemplified in the play. Kochuthambrati, the landlord's daughter, is afraid to be in love with Chodhan. Aragan is also anxious about his son being in love with Kochuthambrati for the same reason, because the love between Kochuthambrati and Chodhan defies the caste norms. The murder of Chodhan as punishment for desiring Kochuthambrati shows the peak of caste violence in the realm of sexuality. Though both Chodhan and Kochuthambrati assert their sexual freedom, the consequences of their assertions are different. While for Chodhan, who is a Dalit, the punishment is death, Kochuthambrati is not directly punished. The anti-caste discourse, as illustrated by the play, not only includes manifestations and consequences of caste violence, it also shows characters who negotiate with the system and thereby challenge it. The play's prologue recovers experiences of caste oppression and illustrates caste as an evil system. The emphasis on Brahminical invasion as the cause for the dispossession of the Dalits, is also a consequence of the Dalits. It's an attempt at Dalit historiography, which had been erased under Brahminic hegemony. This Dalit historiography is premised upon the categorization of people into two, the conquerors and the conquered. The Aryan conquerors are seen to have conquered the indigenous people who are said to be the Dalits. The play defines the present as an extension of the feudal past in which caste is still an active determinant. This challenges the contemporary Brahminical idea that caste is an anachronism of the past. Another strategy through which the play challenges caste is through the declaration of solidarity with the miserable across the world. In the prologue, there is a mention of a fictional place called Tasrak, where people are being tortured. By declaring solidarity and alliance with all the people who are in pain and misery, the play redefines Dalit as a politically conscious standpoint against oppression of all kinds. The invocation of the play juxtaposes a Sanskrit verse, Asatoma Sadgamaya, with a folk revolutionary song. The Sanskrit verse implores God to lead one from falsehood and darkness to truth and light. The folk song talks about people who wanders in the dark. The juxtaposition of the two is a subversive appropriation of Brahminical knowledge, which questions denial of knowledge to the Dalits, not only by taking hold of the Vedic Sanskrit knowledge, but also infusing it with Dalit meanings. The play also presents various kinds of negotiations regarding the question of labor. When the landlord asks Aragan to take his son Chodhan to the field, he agrees with the landlord but procrastinates by making excuses. It is a strategy of survival adopted by the deprived to resist intergenerational exploitation. Chodhan, on the other hand, explicitly expresses his disagreement with the system by refusing to work for the landlord. The strategy adopted by Kunjagarambi is slightly different. She interprets Chiruda's sexual harassment as Chiruda trying to please the landlord and thereby gaining material advantages. So Kunjagarambi decides to report this affair to the landlady and thereby impress her and gain material advantages out of it. Caste being a system which sanctions and legitimates the deprivation, the material deprivation of Dalits, Kunjagarambi's act can be understood as anti-caste. The ploughing scene in the play is an example of Dalit subversion. The ploughing song, which is in the form of a conversation between a laborer and bull tied to the plough, describes the sufferings from the laborer's point of view. The song attempts at subversion of caste norms through the use of irony. In the song, Aragan details the physical torture in a very ironic way. Every time he talks about the torture and pain, he apologizes to the landlord, saying that it was an unintentional interjection. Coming to the anti-caste challenges executed in the realm of sexuality, the play highlights the love relationship between Chodhan and Kochuthambrati. The love between Chodhan and Kochuthambrati can be understood as subversive of the caste norms because they're subverting caste norms by asserting their agency, sexual freedom. As I mentioned earlier, anti-caste discourse is a complex set of ideas which is not merely oppositional but often contradictory. There can be internal contradictions within the anti-caste discourse. So what are the contradictions in the realm of epistemic violence or knowledge? The invocation of the play, which begins with the Sanskrit verse sung by the playwright, can be understood as an imitation of the Brahminical classical traditional theatre, which is in a way reaffirming the superiority of the Brahminical aesthetics. Likewise, in the realm of labor, Kunjagarambi's act of seeking alliance with the landlady is challenging caste so far as she tries to gain material advantages out of it, but at the same time, it operates within the hierarchy without questioning the hierarchy in itself and breaks Dalit solidarity. If we look at the anti-caste politics articulated in the realm of sexuality, the play problematizes the Savarna discourse, which identifies Dalit bodies as undesirable by depicting Chotan as desired by the landlord's daughter. But Chotan is portrayed as an exceptionally politically conscious communist, distinct from the other Dalit characters in the play. So, in a way, the play is mandating exceptionality as a condition for desirability by an upper caste woman. To conclude, the play defines caste as a systemic violence which maintains unequal hierarchical power relations. It identifies the base of caste system as material. The material deprivation of Dalits dehumanizes them and renders them powerless. This definition of caste is relevant in the context of the material deprivation in Manjadikkari. Through the play, the women in Manjadikkari interpret their present material deprivation as a reflection of caste violence, which result in lack of dignity and power. By showing caste as a violent system of material deprivation, it undermines any idea of caste as natural and relates it directly to labor exploitation, which in itself is a fundamental challenge to the caste system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sephora, for this fascinating paper on a play, which would otherwise, be, completely inaccessible to Dalit scholarship. But at the same time, later on we'll get a chance to, talk more about it at the end. And please, by all means, keep questions, start putting questions into the chat bar. And now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Aswathi Moncy Joseph, who's going to talk about decolonial interventions in the cloud, curating digital solidarities, and she's going to focus mainly on the farmers' protest in India, which is, still quite a sort of a marginalized topic in Western media. And Aswathi is an independent researcher, and her work focuses on the disparate but intersecting terrains of the postcolonial, decolonial, feminist, and transversal studies. And she's currently based in Aarhus, Denmark. Thank you, Aswathi.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. I would also like to thank the organizers of this conference and Josh for arranging this meet and everything. So yeah, thank you all. So with that, let me begin my presentation titled Decolonial Interventions in the Cloud, Curating Digital Solidarities. Now, we might remember the umbrella movement that emerged in Hong Kong in 2014. The pro-democracy protesters were largely students who demanded for transparent elections. World media was taken over by the non-violent and creative nature of the protest showcased by the students. Next slide. They started to use umbrellas as a tool for passive resistance to the Hong Kong police's use of pepper spray to disperse them. The protesters used traditional protest songs, banners, installations, and sculptures in their creative mode of protest. As you can see in the following slides, the iconic 3-meter wooden statue of the man holding an umbrella is an example of such creativity. Next slide. Now that's Dennis Ho, a pop singer and pro-democracy activist in the Hong Kong activity in protest. For Dennis, creativity is what the tyrants cannot control nor repress. As a powerful but slow machine with its clumsy structure, it takes time for them to react to any new ideas. By creating diversity in our modes of protest, by injecting creativity, we refuel ourselves. Now, these protesters turn aesthetico-political as they use their creativity to think beyond the established political norms of state oppression. Next slide. What is the aesthetico-political? In his 2018 book, The Aesthetico-Political, Martin Plott conceives the political from the position of an aesthetic. Next slide. The aesthetico-political view for him is the primacy of the plurality of perceptions and appearances in the understanding of the political. This advent of the aesthetico-political saw the birth of modern democracy. The philosophical metrics of the concept was especially developed in the 20th century by the aesthetico-political philosophers as Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Hannah Arendt, and Jacques Rancière. Next slide. As we see here, Merleau-Ponty's late philosophical conception of the flesh grounded the aesthetico-political understanding of politics and democracy. He conceived the body as a way of being, which he called flesh. Body for him was not an incarnated and situated subject. In this, the body existed simultaneously as active and passive, subject and object, seer and the visible. This notion was further developed by Claude Lefort. That brings me to the next slide. He worked on the flesh of the social, a collective way of being of society that is neither subject nor object, seer or visible, but primordially both. Now, as we see on the next slide, Lefort saw individuals as collective actors and societies as two-dimensional or reversible, where it could be active and passive at once. Now we can see two bubbles, active, passive, subject-object. There is this unreachable distance between the two. And this unreachable distance is what Lefort referred to as chiasm. In this chiasm, neither individuals nor societies can see themselves seeing, since all seeing is within themselves. Thus, the aesthetico-political view constantly experiences this inability to complete itself. Now, the aesthetico-political action, as you can see in the next slide, configures collective life in such indeterminacy of experiences and the impossibility to grasp time in its entirety. Now, here, Hannah Arendt develops the two constitutive dimensions of the aesthetico-political action with political kitsch and ideology politics. According to Arendt, while the aim of the aesthetico-political action is to render visible the invisible, the aim of the political kitsch is to anticipate the invisible without ever rendering anything visible. On the other hand, ideological political action reduces in action's meaning to an actor's absolute certitude. For Arendt, it is the combination of this absolute certitude with terroristic state policies that is ideological political action. Arendt's line of thought, as we see in the next slide, finds resonance with Jacques Rancière's aesthetic understanding of politics. The emergence of politics for him occurs when people begin to speak on their own behalf, assume the right to occupy public space. It is this depoliticization of the public space by the hitherto marginalized or excluded. For Rancière, such a politics involves a distribution of the sensible. He argues that politics revolves around what is seen and what can be said about it, around who has the ability to see and the talent to speak, around ways of doing and making. A shared sense of what we have in common. These artistic practices are always already political. That is, aesthetics is at the core of politics. Rancière's notion that aesthetic practices can contribute to distribution of the sensible also foregrounds his insistence on the power of words. Words for him can always already function as an aesthetic practice in its own right. It can do political work in conditioning the distribution of the sensible, a legitimization of certain ways of seeing, feeling, acting, speaking, being in the world with one another. Now, and as such, the relevance of the aesthetico-political regime in modern democracy. Now, it is in this context on aesthetico-political that I bring in my first argument. The first proposition, as we see in the next slide, is that the patterns of cloud protest and solidarity are transculturally distinct, but related as decolonial assemblages. Now, to explicate this argument, I would like to bring in dialogue the tuk-tuk protests of 2019 in Iraq, along with the ongoing farmers' protests in India. The tuk-tuk movement was primarily a demand for reforming the corrupt political system and lack of job opportunities for the Iraqi youth. At its core, it was a demand for free and fair elections that would enable a secular and just government. Now, as we see in the following slides, the three-wheeled motorized rickshaws known as tuk-tuks, in Arabic, it is pronounced as tuk-tuk, evaded the restrictions of the state police to support the protesters. It multitasked as an ambulance that shuttled wounded protesters on the one hand, and also as a diplomat vehicle for strikes. Now, this soon became the face of the revolution, and the first newspaper published by protesting group was named Tuk-tuk. Now, the farmers' protest in India was inspired by this movement. The ongoing farmers' protest in India, as we all know, is against 3 agricultural bills introduced by the Hindu nationalist regime under Prime Minister Narendra Modi in India. The bills do not ensure farmers a minimum support price for their farm produce. It also allows huge corporations to now enter the Indian farming sector with no government security. Though separated by geographical space and cultures, the Indian farmers took inspiration from the tuk-tuk protests. The trolley trucks that the farmers used for transporting their produce have now become a space to sleep and cook at the protest sites. The protesting farmers launched a bilingual newspaper and called it the Trolley Times. Now, much similar to the tuk-tuk newspaper, Trolley Times was a response to the political sensitivity incited by the fascist governments in both countries. The papers became an archive for the voice in both countries. It voiced the demands, concerns, and struggles of the protesters. A group of few activists with their backgrounds in online publishing came behind the workings and dispatch of the newspaper. They resorted to the digital and effectively tapped on the social capital it helped generate. Both the movements moved effectively across the boundless space of social media platforms. Though distinct in origin and method, they got related as decolonial assemblages. Now, for the purposes of my research, I have brought together 2 contradictory yet intersecting theoretical fields here. Especially in this argument, I have used the decolonial in combination with the assemblage. Now, this is an aesthetico-political tool as I see it, and I use it to analyze the curation of digital solidarities. We can see on the following slides the basic tenets of decolonial and the assemblage theories. So that's for you to just have a quick look on it, the concepts, just for a quick look. So now in my thought on these cultural protests, they make links as historical and revolutionary movements against fascist totalitarian regimes, though simultaneously they de-link in terms of its contextual, promissory, and geographical contestations. Now, in this flux between this linking and delinking emerges a relinking of connections and disconnections in the digital space across transcultural sites. This relinking opens possibilities of alliances and solidarities among the protesters. The digital space provides visibility to the hitherto invisible, with its prospects for multiple afterlives. Protest narratives on online platforms gain a transfer of power. Resonating Dr. Priyamvada Gopal. Though they condition each other, they do not determine each other. The agency of the protesters are constantly contesting and emerging in the space. This facilitates their common goal of subverting neo-fascist regimes across cultures. In closing this argument, I take to highlighting some broad potential implications of how I find the analytic of decolonial assemblage as an important constituent of the aesthetico-political. As we see in the following slide, decolonial assemblage envisages linking, delinking, and relinking, and thus facilitates contestations. It is an analytic predicated on the plurality, fluidity, indeterminacy, simultaneity, and diversity in temporalities of perceptions. It thus connects transcultural sites in its dynamics towards the possibility of an alliance and solidarity. They are a useful lens to negotiate discourses built on concrete histories that could produce inflexible, determinate categories. It rather stresses on emergence, multiplicity, and inconclusivity, thus moving beyond the definitive closures of history, economy, and culture. Now, this analytic brings me to my second argument, as seen in this next slide. Protest narratives on digital platforms function as a vehicle to preserve democratic values. As we see in the next slide, Surjit Pattar, a very famous Punjabi poet who was recently in news for returning his Padma Bhushan Award in support of the farmers' protests in India. So his piece was published by the Trolley Times recently. It is titled, "It is a Festival." The poem is titled, "It is a Festival." Now, as we can see, I've quoted a few lines from the poem, and I'm trying to explicate this particular quote. As far as I can see, and as far as I cannot, people are participating in this. People of this earth, of heaven, of the three worlds. It is a festival. In this, Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, Jain, and Sikh are present. Much is visible, and so much more invisible is present. It is a festival. Now, this particular protest narrative elaborates the social dynamic of struggle and conflict regarding the visible and the invisible, the speakable and the unspeakable. The evident dissent in his words could be conceived of as a distribution of the sensible, wherein the poet's word could be understood as a legitimization of his way of seeing, feeling, and experiencing. His words are thus aesthetico-political and is an example of how the aesthetico-political protest narrative could preserve the democratic. Now, as seen in the following slide, Delhi and Movements, a piece written by Geeta Kumari. This was published in the Trolley Times as well. So, I quote, "While participating in 2014 student protests, many of us here, the Indian farmers, felt that while we are fighting for children's rights to study at lower fees, when the Modi government calls us anti-nationals, why does everyone believe it?" She continues, "And recognize those who say these things. During each movement, you will see people from the government and media channels only hurling abuses." Now, this is a translated piece from the Punjabi. So there is this translational kind of translational trouble between the original and what is translated into English. But from what I understand, the subtext of this particular paragraph function as an aesthetico-political action that channel democratic values in the digital space. Here, the narrative converses with the two dimensions of the aesthetico-political action, as we saw in the previous slide of Hannah Arendt, kitsch political action and the ideological political action. Now, in the quoted narrative, the writer points out to the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his followers in its subtext. In other words, the Hindu Nationalist Party leader and his followers are here addressed as kitsch political actors. Why? In trying to determine the indeterminate nature of the farmers' protests and stamping them anti-nationals, Modi could be identified as a kitsch political actor. Simply put, he anticipates popular opinion for drawing nationalist sentiments instead of attempting to rule out a possible solution for the protesting farmers. He simply negates the Indian farmers as the anti-nationals with an absolute ideological certitude. This takes us to the second constituent put forward by Hannah Arendt, the ideological action. Modi combines nationalist ideology with terroristic state policies. As Martin Plott puts it, Modi, as an ideological political actor, is obsessed with the task of purging the nation of parasites and foreigners in order to recreate a healthy social body, such as the one mythically associated with a glorious past. Now, this we can see in the next slide. Take, for example, this caricature printed in the Trolley Times. The subtext of the narrative reveals Modi serving the wishes of the corporate giants who are forefronted in the caricature. The farmers are pictured as parasites in the caricature. So the political actor is consistent with his ideological premise that shows protesting farmers as traitors of the country. They are often referred to as Khalistanis. That goes very well with his ideological premise. The constancy in maintaining such premises saves the political actor, in this case Modi, from the uncertainties of reality and a responsible political action towards the farmers. Here, anti-democratic nature of the promise is brought to the front. Thus, the digital platform opens up greater avenues for protest narratives, making them a vehicle for preserving democratic values. Protest narratives circulated on the digital space thus curate solidarities in their aesthetico-politics. Now, as we see in the next slide, in concluding this argument, let me highlight a few important undertakings of the cloud protest narratives as an aesthetico-political tool that facilitates democratic political action. Cloud protest narratives offer a contradictory space where protesters' narratives engage in the chiasms of territorializations, deterritorializations, or reterritorializations, thus allowing for aesthetic rearticulations. And this is continuous. Number two, at its core, these narratives keep alive division and dissent. This helps channel a plethora of voices, particularly that of the voiceless. Number three, cloud protest narratives promote a collective political relationality of open singularities. This opens up extensive avenues to counter emergent countercultures. Thus, in the advent of right-wing populism and neo-fascistic tendencies world across, the question of democracy and its aesthetico-political dynamics needs to be visited and revisited. I would like to wind up my paper repeating Dennis Hill. As in the next slide, creativity is what tyrants cannot control nor repress. By creating diversity in our modes of protest, by injecting creativity, we refuel ourselves. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Aswathi. That was a wonderful paper, and in itself, quite an inspiring assemblage of theoretical points of view. And that was really quite amazing. Thank you so much. And now we'll move swiftly on to the next paper, which is Putul Sathe's, and she's a faculty at the Research Centre for Women's Studies at the Women's University. Her areas of interest include gender studies, women's writing in the Global South, Indian literature and literature in translation, and her current research area is Dalit masculinities. and her paper has the title Understanding the Interface Between Academic and Transformative Pedagogy. Thank you. Putul?
Thank you. I start? Okay, thank you. So, thank you, Joshua, and good evening to everyone. The focus of this presentation is to employ the concept of transformative pedagogy represented through Sharmila Rege's concept of Phule Ambedkar feminist pedagogy and Bell Hook's concept of feminist classroom to interrogate the space of higher education in India marked by exclusion and also discrimination. I will try to spell out the exclusion and the discrimination in terms of its opposite, that is power and privilege. The higher education institutional space in India is marked by certain elitism, which is a combination of caste and economic inequality entrenched in histories of humiliation, exploitation, and caste-based material inequality. However, as has been pointed out by Sonal D. Desai and Anurej Dubey, there are different narratives of caste-based inequality. So on the one hand, we witness two aspects of caste-based inequality in terms of opportunities and outcomes. In terms of opportunities, inequality in access to land, education, business ownership, and occupation has resulted in material disadvantage. Secondly, inequality of outcome is caused by social and economic discrimination faced by highly qualified members of the lower caste. The other narrative is related to affirmative action, which has changed the link between caste and occupation and has enabled the entry of Dalit in non-traditional occupations and has diluted the role of caste in economic well-being. We have witnessed transformation in rural society brought about by neoliberal economy, the rise of electoral democracy, establishment of institutions of liberal democracy, which in turn has broadened the political order and changed the social profile of Indian elite. However, in the realm of higher education, we have noticed a demographic shift in the composition of our classroom, accompanied by a certain kind of an elitism, which can be defined through Bourdieu's analysis of cultural capital. Bourdieu's analysis of cultural capital has been more or less defined as the accumulated privilege of family, caste, and class histories, which become an integral part of the person and function as symbolic capital. Satish Deshpande, in his article, Caste and Castelessness, has carried this framework forward and points out that the upper caste transformed their caste capital into modern capital. In contrast, Deshpande points out that the political encashment of caste by lower caste has been debated. As a result of this quote, the upper caste are seen as the natural inheritors of modernity and the lower caste as the purveyors of caste, unquote. Secondly, the manner in which the Constitution of India, in its effort to address caste injustice, constrained the victims of caste to demand justice as caste-marked exception, while the beneficiaries, that is the upper caste, were empowered to demand the perpetuation of their advantages as a casteless norm. Therefore, according to Deshpande, the arrival of the unmarked secular citizen, freed of their caste-marked identity, located at the cusp of modernity and tradition, can enjoy their privileges and benefits in an anonymous manner. The unmarked secular citizen is the ancestor of what now emerges as the general category and who are deemed casteless and are synonymous with merit-based admissions. Here, in fact, I would like to refer to the article by Ajanta Subramaniam titled The Meritocrats. In her article, she has pointed out that the three terms, namely general, casteless, and the meritorious, have been used to reinforce the idea that the general category success is not determined by their caste privileges, but by their hard work and therefore all who fall within the reserved category do so by virtue of their caste. Thus, the debate between the meritorious one and the reserved category has more or less determined the debate around educational inequalities in India. And here, in fact, I would like to quote from Ajanta Subramaniam. Quote, it has allowed those who fall within the general category to invoke what Bourdieu calls an imaginary universe of perfect competition or perfect equality of opportunity, a world without inertia, without accumulation, without heredity or acquired properties, and to argue that it is the system of reservations and not historical caste privilege that produces inequality and undermines the modern republican ideal of equal citizenship. In the process, upper caste evacuate caste markers and inhabit the meritocratic norm, while the lower caste become hyper visible as caste whose very presence and relationship to the state are signs of India's incomplete democracy. It is within, unquote, it is within this framework of understanding of unmarked modern secular citizenship, accompanied by the discourse of being a meritorious one, that we witness the rise of casteist attitude. And here I would like to recount the suicide by Chuni Kotal, an Adivasi Dalit student from Bengal in 1992, and the tragic death of Payal Tadvi, a medical student from Mumbai in 2020. Therefore, elitism is manifested in numerous manners within the university spaces, especially in the manner in which the higher academic space has been organized in terms of the admission rules, the syllabus, the classroom, and the teaching rules. The larger academic scenario is defined by conflicting demands of several discourses of the post-Mandal democratic state with token acceptance of social difference, reactionary Brahminical this elitism seeking to impose a common Hindu culture, accompanied by privatization of education and technological innovation. It is in this context that the classroom is a site of struggle, and the challenge is to develop an alternative pedagogy as a political project. This has been pointed out by Sharmila Rege. According to Sharmila Rege, the challenge is to understand how a normal, good teacher and the classroom and a student are socially and politically constructed, and thereby the need to interrogate, quote, our different and contradictory locations within the social relations of teaching and learning, unquote. It is in this context that Rege has elucidated the Phule-Ambedkar feminist pedagogy, which is based on her engagement with Phule and Ambedkar's view on education. Phule and Ambedkar's perspective on education, quote, lies in a double articulation that conceives education not only in terms of cultures of learning and teaching, but also dissenting against which is learned and taught by dominant cultural practices, unquote. This entails constituting students and teachers as modern truth seekers and agents of social transformation. Therefore, this method is one which embraces critical understanding, empathetic love, and equality. So within this, this framework moves away from our methods based on binaries of reason and emotion, public and private, objectivity and this experience, and this objectivity and experience that informs our research and learning. This perspective has further opened up new possibilities with the assertions of Dalit feminisms, which has resulted in a dialogue between Phule, Ambedkarite and feminist points of view. The practice of Phule Ambedkarite feminist of Phule Ambedkar feminist pedagogy is to seek and develop cultures of dissent. One can see significant connections with Black feminist pedagogies that look at education as a path to freedom from existing binaries. Here, I would like to refer to Bell Hooks' concept of the feminist classroom that points to the difference between education as the practice of freedom and that style of education that merely strives to reinforce domination, and she also explores the notion of pleasure in the classroom through transgressions. Therefore, according to Bell Hooks, the feminist classroom is therefore a space, quote, which is not a safe haven, but instead is a site of conflict, tension, and sometimes ongoing hostility. Confronting one another across several differences mean that we must change ideas about how we learn. Rather than fearing conflict, we have to find ways to use it as a catalyst for new thinking for growth, unquote. This is the observation which has been made by Bell Hooks in the context of women's studies classroom. So, besides interrogating the pedagogies employed by us, our classrooms, the figure of the teacher who negotiates between the syllabus, university, and the taught is very crucial. The larger question confronting many like me who are located in a university space marked by inequality of class, caste, negotiating a state-imposed rigid syllabus is how to cause a rupture and thereby question the relations amongst pedagogy, authority, canons, and transformation. The larger questions confronting the academic who is guided by the Phule Ambedkar feminist this pedagogy is how to guard against exclusions and also oppressions, how to move beyond a simple model of authority, discipline, and control in the classroom. How do we achieve a breakthrough in terms of, how do we achieve a breakthrough in terms of going against the compulsions of the canon that defines our teaching practices? And finally, the larger question which has been haunting me, in this case, does the teacher then emerge as the final savior of the students? Finally, an engagement with Phule Ambedkar feminist pedagogy opens up many ways to dismantle the elitism and intellectual aristocracy that continues to define the higher education space here. In the process, perhaps the classroom boundaries will be expanded through critical thinking and will enable the classroom to be a part of the larger civil society movements. However, I end with a note of caution that the path of transformative pedagogy is a hazardous one, because it is not merely about the vision of emancipation, but an understanding of one's own involvement in this process of emancipation. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Putul, for this fascinating paper. And I think these questions about, pedagogy in the classroom, they won't be going away for a long time. And I'm very pleased to be introducing Margarida Martins, whose paper quite neatly complements yours, I think, even though it comes from quite a different location. So Margarida is a researcher at the University of Lisbon Center for English studies and an online lecturer in English language and culture at the University of Alberta in Lisbon. She has a PhD in literary and cultural studies with a thesis on the novels of Arundhati Roy and Kiran Desai, and her main research interests focus on contemporary literature, mainly post-colonial and diasporic, working with theories from social anthropology, cultural studies, literary criticism, and language studies in an interdisciplinary approach to the narrative. And Margarida is also associate editor of the Index Journal of Anglo-Saxonica. Thank you. Margarida, take it away. Margarida, take it away.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Thank you, Josh, and fellow panelists and all the organizers for the conference for giving me this opportunity. So with this paper, I propose a reflection, a personal reflection on the meaning and purpose of research and teaching within this field of social and cultural activism, and the growing awareness I have developed over the years of the importance of this stance in my work. I will illustrate my discussion through my research in cultural studies and post-colonial literature, and on my experience and practice in distance learning education with examples of the topics and texts used in my undergraduate programs and the activities I involve students in, demonstrate that in the right learning environment, knowledge can be constructed through shared experience, the development of empathy, and I quote, critical thinking promotes practices that have the potential to transform oppressive institutions or social relations, end of quote. While living in Australia as a child, I developed an interest and an awareness of society and culture. In my early teenage years, I read quite a lot on the Aboriginals, their practices, myths, and relationship with the land, and was shocked when I visited the Northern Territory, excited about finally meeting Aboriginals in their natural and social setting, to find hardly any. We met one Aboriginal selling souvenirs near Ayers Rock. Although I was still young, I remember him telling us about Uluru as not merely a rock in the middle of a red desert to visit and climb, but as a sacred element in Aboriginal culture. During my undergraduate in social anthropology and ancient history, I was particularly interested, not to mention shocked, to study the history of the arrival of Europeans on new lands and the impact it had on indigenous communities. These elements, as part of my learning process, branched out into an interest for cultural encounters and led me into post-colonial studies. Later, while living in New York, I signed up for a volunteer program called Community Impact, which involved helping with the integration of migrants to New York City. I taught ESL to a multicultural class in Harlem for a year and a half, and it was because of this enriching importance of voice and individual stories. Almost 20 years on from that volunteer program in Harlem, I have come to increasingly realize the responsibility that research carries. The production and dissemination of knowledge in different areas is inseparable from not only a deeper and more involved understanding of the world, also from the struggle for a more inclusive, hence better world. A world whose shifts and transformations have influenced social-political relations and resulted in the reassessment of different cultural realities, giving voice to emerging groups in the defense of rights as citizens of a world we all share. Cultural studies with its interdisciplinarity provided the ground for meaningful research and debate on the issues that concern us all as social beings occupying the same planet. It allows for a range of approaches and alternative stories as undeniably essential complements to the grand narratives that had prevailed. It gave way to the kind of academic interaction through which culture is understood as dynamic, and notions such as equity, tolerance, and justice are performed on the world stage and therefore occupy a place in the practice of everyday life. Postcolonialism, which, as Boehmer states, I quote, first emerged as a critical approach evolved in movements of cultural opposition to empire, itself an early form of globalization, end of quote, plays an important part in focusing on the specific, the local, and how it is perceived and staged transnationally and globally. This project, Boehmer's word, although many questions hover regarding its name, its meaning and aim, still has a central role in the raising of ethical awareness on the experience of people of former colonized nations by creating the space for new perspectives to be acknowledged. Decades on from decolonization, many imbalances remain, and it is in the hands of researchers, artists, and teachers to look for ways to reach further and deeper into the inequalities and struggles which, I quote, continue in globalized forms into the present. I currently teach at a distance learning university, the only one of its kind in Portugal. Students are mostly adults of ages between 35 and 60, coming from different backgrounds, motivations, professional careers, location, and social situations. There are a lot of, just to give you some examples of the type of students, there are a lot of police, military, but also civil servants, freelancers of all kinds. There are students spread throughout the world, immigrants, unemployed students, retired students. There are also those with special needs, with all kinds of disabilities, and those who are in prison, whose only possibility to do a degree is by enrolling in distance education. So there's quite a variety of students. According to Niblet, I quote, activist education can be defined as an intentional educational practice in which participants engage in guided learning activities that help them understand themselves as capable of affecting change for social and ecological justice, end of quote. Teaching, like research, carries responsibilities because it is the formation of citizens and citizenship. The classroom is a space where attention to issues of social justice, equity, and the ecology is called upon. Distance learning provides the necessary space and the right environment for the sharing of experiences and motivations of adult learners who are an important social group, since they are parents, grandparents, workers. They are spread throughout the world and actively involved in civil society. And I quote, learning derived from activist education occurs through activities that are hands-on, minds-on, developmentally appropriate, and at least partially student-centered, student-directed. Activities are presented in ways that open a practice field where students and educators can enact lived democracy in the form of facilitated participation and assistance to the structures that constitute human society on both local and global levels, end of quote. The teaching of English language can be very flexible, so it has been possible to slowly structure the course to fit my objectives. The course uses a theme-based and content-based approach to language with a focus on communicative and collaborative learning. Each level is structured into general topics which allow for different approaches and promote the sharing and understanding of experience from an internal and external perspective. Debates in the class forum are sparked through questions that are meant to provoke both personal responses to the theme, to those that raise awareness, generate knowledge, and enhance empathy on the experience of others, whether other students in the class or others in other social, cultural, political, and economic contexts. Learning materials are adapted from authentic sources, such as articles, documentaries, images, virtual exhibitions, clips from films, interviews, excerpts from novels, and short stories. Some examples of topics are health and illness, and these topics enable students to explore the concepts from their own personal position, from their cultural perspective, but also to research on other cultures, for example, on how illness is perceived or treated in other contexts, and report back to the class on their research findings. Other examples of topics are diversity, education, food, sustainability, starting over, childhood, and nature. In each of these topics, as I have referred, questions move from the local to the global, from the personal to the general, from the familiar to the unfamiliar, allowing students to both talk about themselves and to explore others' experiences and realities. With this type of activity, it is my aim to, quote, offered, to create a space for debate where people make meaning in their lives around questions of their identity, how they belong, what their sense of place is, while building knowledge and opening the debate to the inclusion of others. Topics and activities encouraged to reflect on the and debate ideas to express their views. This is a foreign language class, further empowers since they are mobility to use a foreign language with a purpose. Language and communication play a fundamental part in giving voice to different beliefs, and in allowing for active participation in different areas of social and political engagement. Along with the debates, they also role-play speeches, write articles for magazines and newspapers, write letters or role-play talks at local institutions, organizations, and schools, and do other of this type of activity which provides the space, even if in a virtual learning environment context, for the practice and motivation for social activism. Creating this kind of space within a learning environment where students develop the skills, motivation, openness to inquiry, reflection, and debate on meaningful issues, and the response and motivation that I have witnessed is that, I quote, "Citizen action is an important part of the contemporary human story." Education, educators are responsible for creating the right environment and introducing ideas through different activities, and finally, for encouraging action. The third component is that which I am still working on. I'm still exploring for a way to incorporate action into the learning curricula, or at least to encourage students to pursue this part themselves and report back to the class. I'm still exploring this. Suggestions, welcome. As a researcher with an interest in postcolonialism, diaspora, Anglophone literatures, culture, and the English language, in order to raise awareness to other social, cultural, and political contexts, I also introduce different authors and short stories to the classes every year. I look mainly for contemporary writers in English and stories through which the different issues can be explored. Each story provides a new look at culture, society, and history, revealing behaviors, patterns, practices, symbols, differences in language, awareness of such issues as war, trauma, social injustice, migration, displacement, belonging and non-belonging, illness, the environment, among others. The diversity of backgrounds and contexts of the students provide a wonderful scope for interpretation, which never ceases to surprise me. Over the years, I have used short stories by Adichie, Jhumpa Lahiri, Ken Liu, Edwidge Danticat, Samrat Upadhyay, Manjushri Thapa, Tim O'Brien, Alice Munro, to mention a few. And again, I'm still exploring, so suggestions welcome. Short stories are effective to use in class since they are short and interventive, providing powerful entries into different and otherwise distant or unfamiliar realities, drawing these closer and creating empathy for alternative visions. Stories as narratives of experience, I quote Boma, provide a gateway to feeling otherness, experiencing how it might be to be besides oneself, and show how voices cannot be silenced in the rethinking of history, society. Alternative approaches to history and culture reflect, and I quote Said, the conscious effort to enter into the discourse of Europe and the West, to mix with it, transform it, to make it acknowledge, marginalize, or suppressed or forgotten histories, end of quote. Promoting the type of practice that raises awareness to different issues that surround the post-colonial legacy means, and I quote, to ask searching questions of the global by refusing to take it as its word, its sensorially stimulating, allegedly post-imperial word, end of quote. It provides the route for research to raise awareness of people, culture, and society beyond theory by opening spaces for new narratives and bringing to light patterns of struggle and authority. The researcher and to raise awareness, spark debate and reflect, create empathy, and spread the knowledge that will thinking and consequently lead to action, creating the space for change to occur. I quote, activist education engages students intellectually in learning tasks that are relevant to their lives and communities. Simultaneously, students may become engaged citizen activists, people who see themselves as capable of affecting positive change for social justice. End of quote. It is very difficult to change the world, to undo history, to defy established beliefs, to deny the violence, to reverse the injustice, to overturn. However, it's possible to regenerate thinking, promote debate, and expand forms of expression in academia, in research, and in art. And, to quote Boehmer again, to find ways to begin again and go on is today's imperative. Through distance education, I have been able to not only explore empathy, activism, experience, and voice in the class, but also to introduce awareness of other cultures, ethnicities, and experience, even if still in a general, a broad sense, in a post-colonial or decolonial setting, and not only through discussion topics and short stories. Through discussion topics and short stories. Students expand their knowledge, are introduced to alternative stories, invited to question classifications and divisions, and awakened to empathy and to a better understanding of the world and themselves. It is essential that post-colonialism move beyond the institutional or disciplinary position to explore through active and innovative practices how, as John Dewey once wrote, life is a self-renewing process through action upon the environment. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Margarida. That was wonderful. And now we have a good 15 minutes for questions. So if our other presenters want to turn their cameras on again. I always have questions, but I don't want to always make use of the chair. So if you have any, I'm very happy to let you ask your questions first, since there are no questions in the chat at the moment. Well, if not, we maybe start with you, Sephora. Could you tell us a bit more about the context of how you came at this, and how you position yourself as a researcher, and how it fits into your larger research project?
Yes, Nicole. So I met this group of women as part of my field work, which is related to my doctoral research. So I went to Manjadikkari knowing that there are various Dalit Christian communities living in this space. But the location itself is very important. You know, the location of Manjadikkari, the geographical location of Manjadikkari is important because it is very near to the most famous tourist space named Kumaragam in Kerala. So the place is actually very developed. But Manjadikkari stands as an island which is extremely materially deprived. So, and when I explored a little bit about the history of the place, I came to understand that after the land reforms being introduced in Kerala, there is a very strong effort to put all the Dalits into one place, and that place became materially deprived, and it continues to be materially deprived. So that's how my attention reaches Manjadikkari, and I went there. So I met these women. These women, when I met them, they were working in Thodilurappu. So they were sitting on the ridges of the fields, rehearsing the play. And that's how I, talked to them, and they introduced me. They were making the props for their performance. They were preparing the special kind of cap, which is worn by the landlords, which used to be worn by the landlords. So they were making it using the arecanut leaves. So that's how I got introduced to the context. And it's very important, and it's very significant that they are performing the play, or they're rehearsing the play for a club named Sanjeevani, which includes both men and women. But it's very interesting that they, in some ways deliberately exclude men from the performance, and it's completely done by women. So everything, even the preparation of the banners, just for the construction of the stage, only the men involved. So that is the context of Manjadikkari. And as a researcher, I think there is some kind of very distinct power relation operating between me and the people, because in many ways I'm an outsider, and there is this power relation which I have to negotiate with the people in Manjadikkari. But I think my taking of the text itself is very political, and it's contributing significantly to the area of Dalit studies, because in some ways I am interacting and recovering knowledge which is produced from Dalit standpoint, and trying to look at it from the perspective of Dalit theory, which is, at least I'm trying to think along with them instead of thinking for them. I'm trying to think with them. So I think that itself is a political project in that way. That's it.
Interesting. That links in some interesting ways. The politics of a researcher and the politics of pedagogy in a classroom. They're in some very closely related. And I was just wondering whether maybe you, Margarida, and Putul, whether you just wanted to elaborate a little bit how you envisage this idea of, Margarida, you focus on empathy, and Putul, you focus on the concept of dissent. And in some ways that sounds like quite a contradictory stance. Do you want to kind of, what came to your mind when you listened to each other's projects or papers, rather?
Should I respond?
Yeah,
Margarita,
yes.
In fact, frankly speaking, I could relate to a lot of the points she was making, because I mean, here in India also, for students coming from the vernacular medium, we also face the same kind of quote unquote problems and basically challenges. More than problems, it's basically challenges. So when I was listening to her, I found the use of this empathetic understanding, which can be translated into some kind of an empathetic, this activism also, Margaret, I think that is what you were doing. So that was something very interesting for me. So as I was listening to you, I thought that yes, in a different kind of a cultural situation, we are also doing the same thing. So that is where I could perhaps relate to her this empathy and a kind of, and the teacher playing the part of a cultural activist, so I thought that was very interesting for me. As far as dissent is concerned, Nicole, that is something defining our higher academic space now. I think just today, these 3 students have been released on bail. The 2 students from JNU and the third one from this Jamia. I think for us now, especially in the kind of policies which are coming through the new education policy, that is NEP, in which the state is trying to turn the entire space of this higher education into a transactional one. It's a very dangerous move which is happening. So I think, therefore, for me, dissent is very important. And that is where I like to go back to Rege's concept of the Phule Ambedkar feminist pedagogies, where they say that you learn to dissent, and especially in the Indian classrooms, especially the fact that even what has happened in IIT Kanpur, I think, that the English teacher who was actually abusing the students, it only speaks about the need to learn to dissent, and especially to learn to dissent against the dominant modes of learning. I think that is something which is central to Dalit standpoint theory also, learning to dissent. So for me, I'm so glad, in fact, you have raised these 2 points. I think dissent and also empathy should go. I mean, they more or less complement each other. So I think there's a kind of a fruitful tension there. That is how I would respond to you. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you.
Yes, I thought that there were similarities, and particularly even concerning this issue of dissent and empathy. I think dealing with adult learners, it's interesting because they come from such different backgrounds, different experiences, and so it's very interesting to see to listen to them, and that's what I like to promote in class, is this participation, this sharing of ideas, even if they are contradictory, to the mainstream or to each other, but to be able to listen to each other and find and have this safe space where they can express their views. As I said, first from more personal experience, their own stories, their own narratives, and then moving into kind of the other students, the other contexts. So I think this is what I found. I like the similarities and the different, how Putul's paper spoke to me in this sense as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that every time you enter a classroom, you sort of have to weave a new tapestry again and again, depending on who you find. You know, it's fascinating, but also it's almost got hard work as well, isn't it?
Yes.
And Aswathi, I just wondered, how do you think, because you told us in the break, how you at the moment sort of situated in Scandinavia, Denmark at the moment, and I just wondered what you, this kind of diasporic location, whether that helped you create, these theories about assemblage, which in a way sort of mirror, it's almost like your theory and your approach mirror each other in quite productive ways.
So yeah, it is. It all springs up from my own life. It's very organic with what I have, from my lived experience. So it's like I live here and I see people of different race coming together, gathering. For example, my kids' kindergarten is a very good example for the concept of decolonial assemblage, I would say, because two of my kids going there, their first language is, of course, my mother tongue, Malayalam, and their second language is both English and Danish. So they are sort of trilingual. The way they try and sort of get along, trying to connect with each other, there is sort of an assemblage happening, a kind of alliance that is made over there, a kind of solidarity that is created by learning the native speaker's language and, creating a kind of space for knowledge production. So it is a great way to look at it that way. So small things in everyday real life systems, we can find decolonial assemblages. That's just one stance that I proposed in my paper. So yeah, that's how I see it. From everyday life, you can get it into your academic thinking procedure, and then work over that, and then come into some sort of contestation, because it's always it's always going to be contradictory. The space is always going to be contradictory, and there won't be a definite solution to any questions you put out in the space of knowledge creation. So it's very important that we are open to such contestations. Though contradictory in nature, the key is to be open to the intersections where we can meet each other, where we can look for commonalities, while at the same time being open to what is not common in each other. So in a sense, your singularity in the many differences that come around you. So that is how I look at it. So yeah, that's a great way to incorporate everyday systems into your cultural political thinking. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Aswathi. In some ways, that links all your papers as well, doesn't it? And I think it's also it's a really an important way to kind of see how we are shaped as researchers and as teachers, through these things, encounters in the kindergarten and so on, all this kind of makes us, the type of people who we are, absolutely. And I have a question for you, Sephora, and you may have seen it in the chat, but I will read it out because the audience on YouTube won't be able to see this. So one of my PhD students, Purnachandra Naik, asks, caste hierarchy and ownership of land, or for that matter, other resources, are somewhat different in Kerala than in other parts of the country. Although Brahmanism is the reigning ideology, Brahmins are not the only hegemonic group that perpetuates oppression in the context of Kerala, as in other privileged land-owning groups, like Nayars and Syrian Christians, almost compete in perpetuating oppression against Dalits. Does the play reflect on this tension? And if it does, how? And it's a long question, but you can see it, at least Sephora, you can anchor yourself in it.
Yes. So if we compare the caste system or the caste practices in Kerala with other states in India, one of the very prominent differences is that in Kerala, I mean, in other states, there is untouchability, practices untouchability, where people belonging to Dalit communities are, not allowed to touch, or they are considered as impure. The pollution happens only through touch. But in Kerala, it's very different. In Kerala, even the proximity is polluted. So the definition of caste, or the dynamism of caste, is entirely different in Kerala. And especially in the present context, caste operates in very subtle ways. You can't really see caste working out, but you can feel it. So that's one of the very many differences between how caste operates in Kerala and in other states in India. And thinking about caste as an the relationship between Brahmins and Dalits, the outcast, I think it's different, because caste, as I understand it, is a system of graded hierarchy, which in every rung. So it's not just between Brahmins and Dalits. So in every rung, even within Brahmins, there is this hierarchy that each rung is highly divided, highly hierarchized. So it's not just an opposition between Brahmins and Dalits or outcasts, but even within Dalit communities, there are subcastes. So that's how it is, the caste hegemony is maintained. It's not just about Brahmins and Dalits. And I think in the play does not really talk about other castes or OBCs or Shudras. In the case of Kerala, Shudras, who are the lower castes, are also powerful. So it's not a neat categorization. So in the play does not really talk about Dalits and other, other lower castes. So the Dalits are the outcasts who are completely outside the Varna system, and lower castes are those who occupy the fourth rung, the last rung of the Varna system. So the play does not show the dynamism between the lower caste and the Dalits, but the play is more focused on the relationship between Dalits and Brahmins. So by clearly stating that the landlord is a Brahmin. So that's it. So the play does not talk about that aspect of graded hierarchy. It's very oppositional between Brahmins and Dalits.
Yeah, it's really tricky, isn't it, to get all of this into a play? All of the nuances, right in the farmers, and the farmers are
exactly
movement as well.
But at the same time, if you look at the context of Manjadikkari, which is not really mentioned in the play, you can see that in Manjadikkari, no Brahmins live there. It's a space completely occupied by lower caste and Dalits, and the hierarchical relation operate between the OBCs, or the lower caste, and the outcasts. So in Manjadikkari, what happens is the OBCs are more into fishing and boating, such jobs, whereas the Dalits are the not peasants, but the agricultural workers who are daily wage workers. So there is a very and also the Communist Party is very strong in Manjadikkari. So the authoritative positions of the group, the communist group, is mostly taken by people belonging to OBC community, not the Dalits. And if you look at the history of Manjadikkari, also it's very significant, because these movements like left movement, communist movement, Naxal movement, all these were very popular in Manjadikkari. But even within these movements, there is a very clear marginalization and discrimination of Dalits, and even in the depiction of Chotan as a communist in the play does not really explicitly say that Chotan is a communist, but it is implying. And at the same time, if you look at the character of Chotan closely, you can see that Chotan is not working for the landlord, but he's not against his father working for the landlord. So it's, in a way, the play is showing the contradictions within how Dalits respond to caste, and how the identity, the communist and Dalit identity, complicates the matter further. So the play is not ignoring those complexities, but at the same time, the play is not including every complexity, as you can very well imagine. That's
Absolutely. Thank you. I mean, we could talk about this in all of those wonderful papers. We will have to just continue this conversation in our social event, so but for now, I just have to bring this kind of this official session to a close. So thank you all four of you for your wonderful paper. It was wonderful. And we're now, off to the third panel, but I'm very much looking forward to seeing you again at the social event. So thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.